The Hitman World of Assassination trilogy should easily be one of my favorite game series of all time, but for one reason or another, 47's latest set of games have yet to stick with me fully. The episodic release of Hitman 1 threw a curveball at me that made it hard to get into a consistent groove, and Hitman 2 came at a bad time with a bunch of other games releasing in the same week. Now, I'm not a mega fan of the series, but I've probably put 100 hours or more into Hitman Blood Money, and I loved it, and this trilogy is the closest we've ever gotten to the feel of that game. Despite this comparison though, the latest trilogy had yet to pull me in and engross me in the same way that I was with Blood Money. Sure, I had liked the new games, but I didn't love them. I enjoyed them at the surface level, but I never really dove in deep enough to get a true feel for how they played. I decided that with Hitman 3, that things would be different. I would clear out my schedule and strong-arm myself into devoting many hours towards exploring these sandboxes to get a feel for how it all ticked. And after putting about 30 hours into the game, I've come to the ho-hum realization that Hitman 3 is once again a copy job of the previous two games, with a new set of levels being the only tangible difference. There are some welcome new inclusions, but it's not the culmination of half a decade of series growth that it should be. I played through Hitman 3 and I really enjoyed my time with it, but I gotta bite the bullet and just say it. Hitman 1, 2, and 3 should have been a singular experience. After playing through Hitman 2 in 2018, I, like many others, came to the conclusion that it was just more Hitman 2016, which wasn't necessarily a bad thing. 3 years later though, that opinion has soured, and it's safe to say that Hitman 3 is once again just more Hitman, despite the inclusion of a few new ideas. That still doesn't make it a bad thing, but the series' repetition is starting to feel a lot like stagnation. IO Interactive's financial struggles have been well documented, and so it's no surprise that the games were made into a trilogy with very little differences between each iteration. All it takes is one look at the game's menu system to provoke the sensation that this could have been one massive and epic game, but instead it was broken into three. Now, I know that isn't the case. I know that these maps probably weren't made or even imagined when Hitman 2016 released. But when I see the repeated menu layouts that are identical to the previous two games, as well as the entirety of those previous two games being within this one, it results in this sinking feeling that I'm playing the tail end of a live service title. And that description really isn't overselling it, as there's been plenty of microtransactions and in-game purchases alongside of time-exclusive content since the trilogy's inception. Speaking of the previous two games, yes, you can access the entirety of Hitman 1 and 2 within Hitman 3 for free if you already own the other games, but they can also be purchased separately and played within Hitman 3. This is cool, but it once again drives home that feeling that these games should have just been a solo experience. Not to mention, I found it annoying to carry over my previous games into this one. In my opinion, having Hitman 1 and 2 installed on the console should be enough for it to register in Hitman 3, but that isn't the case, if you own a physical disc at least. Instead, they want you to have it installed onto your console, and they also want you to sign up for an IO Interactive account and jump through hoops just to play through the previous games again. Maybe this is petty, but I just couldn't be bothered. It was cumbersome and annoying. I don't want to sign up for an IO Interactive account just to be spammed with more useless emails. I say cut the bullshit and just let us play the games if we've already bought them. Diving into the levels of Hitman 3 confirms the suspicion that this game will just be more of the same. From how the maps are designed, to the behavior of the NPCs, to the availability of mission stories, to the numerous challenges available, to how cutscenes are implemented, to how disguises work, the storytelling, and much, much more. It's all running on the same engine, utilizing pretty much the same code, with just new maps for NPCs to populate and for 47 to trek through. Sequels should look to build on what is great about the previous games. There's nothing wrong with providing a similar experience, but in the case of Hitman 2 and 3, they feel like carbon copies or DLC that is being sold for full price, and it just doesn't really feel good as a consumer. That's not to say there's no value in this game, it just doesn't feel good because everything feels so similar. Yet there are some new features, but they're about as shallow as you can get. There's obviously new levels with new disguises, mission stories, weaponry, and random shit to find. Some are good, but they push the series laterally instead of forward. Last time around, the big new feature was ducking in tall grass to blend into the environment. So, what did we get this time? Well, we got a camera. You can take pictures in the world, and there are some challenges that are tied to it. And it can also be used to open up some locks if you have the right access code. That's it. There's also keypads that require codes for access, but they function almost identically to a locked door. So basically, what we got here is two new ways to present a locked door. And I think a big reason that explains the lack of innovation is that it seems that these games were always designed to be able to be played in one another. For example, it was always intended that Hitman 1 would be accessible in Hitman 2, and that 1 and 2 would be accessible in 3. And because they want to allow players to experience those previous two games within this one, it means that the new inclusions in Hitman 3 can't be too different. The series' insistence on being live service-esque has constricted progress, resulting in an experience that is still fun, but once again, say it with me, it's just more Hitman. If IO Interactive refuses to offer up any new modes of gameplay to shake up the formula, then Hitman 3 must rely on its maps to carry the experience and justify the game's existence. Hitman 3's levels really needed to wow consistently, mission after mission, without ever skipping a beat, in order for the player to shake the unflinching feeling that this is yet another 1.5 version of Hitman 2016. Utilizing every tip and trick the studio had learned from developing the prequels was a must in order for this third game to be the apex of what can be achieved using this formula. So, how did they fare? Dubai is the best tutorial level that the trilogy has given us. Okay, it comes with a caveat, to be fair, it's not the actual tutorial. The actual tutorial is the same one we got in Hitman 1 and Hitman 2 repeated once again. You're not forced to do it, but the game does suggest it with this tiny ass font if you want to quote-unquote refresh your skills, which is almost insulting to new players who make Hitman 3 their first experience with the series. The game doesn't really consider it to be part of the main campaign, and because of that, I will be considering Dubai as the tutorial for the sake of this video. Unlike the tutorial in Hitman 1, it's the real deal, not a training simulation. And while it's not as extensive as other levels, it's much more complex than Hawke's Bay in Hitman 2. Parachuting in from above immediately elevates the drama and the tension, and actually having to navigate into the level is something we really haven't had to do before. It's a nice deviation from the player's expectation on a first playthrough, and thankfully it can be skipped in subsequent runs, mitigating the time sink that comes with it. It's a win-win. Once inside, the massive skyscraper quickly reveals its beauty while slowly unveiling its density as the player bobs and weaves through different areas. This crammed feeling has become a staple of the series. There's often a few distinct locations spread across a Hitman level, separated by an open segment. Each of these unique areas has a set of rules that come with them, like which areas are open to the public versus which require a disguise, as well as the layout of the environment, which often has a sense of interconnectedness. And this opening level is no different, but much of the fat has been cut away, resulting in a leaner level that still feels familiar to fans of the trilogy. You have your open area where the crowds gather, but there's also an exclusive penthouse, an art exhibit, and a series of staff-only hallways that connects it all. Returning players will be able to dive right in and get to work learning which disguises grant what access, as well as the pathways that the targets cycle through. New players, on the other hand, aren't overwhelmed immediately, as there's really only two directions to go in, and both will trigger a mission story if they choose to pursue them. Mission stories continue to be a great inclusion as it incentivizes replayability while also offering new players a path to success that may get the creative juices flowing for subsequent attempts. And those creative juices are a vital component to the Hitman series, as experimentation is the name of the game. The world of Assassination trilogy has always been about giving the player a set of sandboxes and a set of rules that define those sandboxes, and then letting them attempt to kill by whatever means necessary. In the previous two games, this central component of player expression wasn't made obvious in the tutorial, as you were pretty much railroaded down a linear path. Hell, that was even true in Blood Money. No tutorial until Dubai has made the core idea of player freedom more obvious, and its ability to communicate that immediately is commendable and praiseworthy. As I completed more and more tasks within Dubai and began prepping for my first run in the Dartmoor level, I couldn't help but to feel disappointed with how the game handles rewards. In a game tailored towards player freedom, it sucks having to play through a level potentially a dozen times before unlocking important fixtures within 47's arsenal, like the sniper rifle and remote mines. I'd argue that some of these tools are essential to the core Hitman experience, and locking them behind sometimes excessive requirements just doesn't feel good. These rewards are also tied to specific levels, so there's a chance that a player will have to play through their least favorite map numerous times just to get a tool that they want to use in other levels. On paper, and honestly most of the time in reality, doling out rewards slowly is good, but this drip feed of progression sometimes runs counterintuitive to a game about giving the player tons of options within a constrained rule set. A better middle ground approach would have been allowing the player to select which tool or upgrade they receive as they level up, and with that you could still use the same incremental reward system. But with what we got, I just feel like I'm getting random rewards at random times. As we work our way to the next level, I wanted to briefly talk about the setup of levels. No matter where you're at within a level, it all functions according to a time schedule and a rule set. NPCs move from location to location, with each moment offering up a new potential method of elimination. Some are quite serious, but others include a humorous undertone that the series has always been known for. There's a wink and nod element of hysterics within the Hitman series, and implementing funny assassinations has always been one of the series' strengths. Regardless of which assassination approach you take though, you'll have to contend with the rules of the world. These rules dictate the entire experience, such as where the player is allowed to go, which disguises work in each area, what items they're allowed to carry within them, which NPCs will be able to see through their disguises, and much, much more. All of these rules create a sense of realism. This believability of the world often works quite well in mission stories and when the player chooses a stealth approach, but it can break down quickly in gunfights. You can wipe out a whole floor of enemies in a loud and brutal fashion just to uncover that everyone else in the level is blissfully unaware. There's also moments where you take out a target and have guards nearby react with such a delay that you're able to run away and re-establish stealth within a matter of minutes. And because it's a game, everyone in the world has to eventually get back onto schedule, despite the fact that a murder has just taken place in front of their very eyes. Guards just drag a body to a broom closet and comment on how it's been a weird day before heading back to their patrol route like nothing is out of the ordinary. These moments are perhaps necessary so that the player can learn the state of the level and its schedule, but the rigidness of it can shatter believability and immersion in a hurry. It was a problem found in Hitman 2016, and it continues to exist here 5 years later. Regardless, we press on to Dartmoor, where we must eliminate Alexa Carlisle and reclaim a case file on the Constant, who I guess we've been pursuing since the first game, but you'd be forgiven for not realizing it. I've noticed online that this mission is highly acclaimed, with many folks citing it as their favorite in the game, and for some within the entire trilogy. I don't want to take away that enjoyment from anyone else, but I can't help but feel like a lot of this level's praise stems exclusively from the Sherlock Holmes-esque mission story. In it, 47 assumes the role of a detective and investigates a murder for a chance to get up close and personal with the target. On a first playthrough, anyone who uses mission stories is going to be roped into this one before they've even entered the level proper. The PI is just put right in front of you, waiting to be subdued and stripped of his clothing to embark on a murder mystery. It's a twist on expectations, as the game takes on an investigative element, which I'll admit is kinda cool. It builds on existing mission stories and actually has a lot of open-ended sections where the player is forced to find clues without being prompted into them. It's a great way of addressing the main problem that plagues mission stories, that being that they basically play the level for you. The murder mystery provides a structure, but it doesn't hold your hand and complete every task within the questline for you, which is great. Still, I wish this mission story was introduced more organically instead of throwing it right into the player's face. It's good for what it is, but it dominates this level so much that other mission stories within it suffer. There's only 2 other mission stories to complete, and both are over in a handful of minutes. One sees you assuming the role of a photographer and capturing a family photo, which can be arranged to electrocute the target, and the other is luring the target to the graveyard to dispose of her. Their inclusions are fine, but they seem so half-baked when compared to the excitement of the Sherlock Holmes mission. It really raises the bar on these mission stories by quite a lot, and so the rest of the content within this mission suffers because of it. There's another issue with the England level, but it's not exclusive to Dartmoor. The game's inclusion of alternate objectives outside of killing has always stuck out like a sore thumb. On a first playthrough of a level, finding additional information can feel like a puzzle to solve. But that's the problem. Once it's solved, there's no more challenge to be had with it. In this level, you're tasked with finding a case file on Arthur Edwards. On my first playthrough, I earned it by completing the detective story mission and having it handed to me as a reward for my hard work. This was a very weird moment, where Madame Carlisle recognizes you as an assassin and yet just forks over the file anyway, fully trusting you solely on the fact that you haven't killed her yet. It was memorable, if not a little strange. On subsequent runs though, the mystery of the case file's location was over, and collecting it for level completion becomes a chore. There's always an element of variation when tackling the assassinations. You can do them in many different ways, given the sandbox structure of the level. These alternate objectives run so counterintuitive to that though, as getting your hands on them usually means repeating the same run over and over again just to finish things up. For instance, when I completed the Undertaker mission story, I was outside in the cemetery. Carlisle was dead and buried, but I still had to head into the mansion and grab the case file before escaping, which meant sneaking and grabbing the same disguises that I had already used countless times before. The obvious answer seems to be mixing up the location of the case file amongst various parts of the level to ensure it feels fresh each time. This randomization, though, might lead to even more player frustration as they eliminate the target in a cool new way just to fumble through the rest of the world trying to find the damn case file. To me, it signals that the alternate objectives were not a good idea, and I'm sad that they returned in this game. Now, there are some more alternate objectives in later levels, and I think they're handled much better, but at least here in Dartmoor, it just leads to too much repetition. Throughout this entire trilogy, most of these alternate objectives end up being a nuisance more times than not. Now, I will concede that on this particular map, it would be very easy to just walk in, kill the target, and leave within a few minutes, making the mission too short. Still, I would have rather just seen a second target included instead of a secondary task. Berlin is a dream come true for the Hitman purist, as the level offers up very little in terms of player guidance. At this point in the story, your partner Gray has been killed, and you've lost contact with your handler Diana, meaning 47 has to go rogue and get shit done on his own. This means there won't be anyone phoning in to start mission stories or to go over intelligence with you. It also means that targets aren't going to be highlighted on the map in a first playthrough, meaning you're going to have to track them down on your own, and it's a smart way of reinforcing the story beats within the gameplay. I think it's a really great idea, but I'm not sure the game itself gives new players enough time to be ready for these drastic changes. Before this, all you have is the tutorial level and then the Dartmoor level, and within that Dartmoor level, most players are just going to follow the private eye mission story to completion. Because of that, it's fair to assume that some new players won't realize the levels are meant to be replayed, and they'll arrive at Berlin with very little understanding of how the game works in its entirety. It's almost like the developers assumed you played Hitman 1 and 2, as if they were all meant to be part of one great game. I'm sorry to keep harping on that point, but it once again becomes relevant here. I'm not saying that new players will be completely lost without the aid of Diana, but they are more likely to struggle in this mission because of it. And yeah, that's not necessarily a bad thing, as it can be a tough love teaching moment, but I do think it should have come as the fourth mission instead of the third. This would have given the player just a little bit more time to understand how levels function. For returning players though, Berlin is one of the best missions in Hitman 3, as it feels like one of the few times where the developers trust in the player's patience and intelligence. The only hand-holding it offers is the normal challenge menu that vaguely suggests assassination techniques, and also on subsequent runs, all the targets are highlighted for convenience. Besides that though, player-driven exploration and experimentation becomes the name of the game. Now, these targets don't really have the same level of personality as some of the others, but it's not really a big deal, because tracking them down one by one, waiting for them to identify themselves, is like being a shark with blood in the water. The sheer quantity of targets makes up for the lack of personalities, as there's 11 of them to kill, with only 5 being required for mission completion. With many targets comes many opportunities for elimination. Now, there are mission stories to uncover within this level, but they aren't laid out for you and will require some thought and ingenuity to complete. My personal favorite was the one where you pose as a club owner and lure a handful of the ICA agents into your office for a firefight. It was actually kinda nice to see a shootout in the series, as I feel like it's something that almost never happens as part of the mission stories. There's also the plethora of accidental kills that you'd expect, such as dropping a massive tube on a guy's head. Oh, and then there's the sniper rifle that you can find. One of my favorite experiences with this game was locating this rifle, taking it to the radio tower, and picking off targets from afar. It's ultra satisfying. Playing this less defined experience may incentivize some folks to play the game on harder difficulties or to turn mission markers off, which is never a bad thing. We sometimes get more out of games if we sacrifice a bit of convenience and learn to think and act for ourselves. Regardless of what approach you take though, Berlin highlights the trilogy's greatest strength: its replayability. Almost every mission includes 3 categories of kills: the mission stories, the challenge assassinations, and the classics. The mission stories, as I've mentioned, are lengthy and full of steps to complete in order to reach the ideal moment of assassination. The challenge kills are highlighted in the menu, but setting them up requires the player to truly explore the level and get a grasp on all its functions and pathways. And those can really be some of the most rewarding to uncover on your own. And then of course there's the classics, like strangling a target, shooting them, poisoning them, and more. Each of these 3 categories typically has a multitude of different assassinations within them, creating a vast amount of potential routes for the player to uncover. Each game has only given the player 6 or so maps, and without these seemingly limitless options for replayability, the game would have been over far too quickly. Experiencing a level over and over again might sound like a slog, but it is actually quite rewarding, as each new attempt furthers your understanding of the level and promotes a feeling of mastery as you learn its inner workings. And as I wrap up my thoughts on this map, I just gotta say this too: the Berlin mission somewhat reminded me of Hitman Absolution, with the whole idea of the ICA being compromised and 47 having to go rogue. To be honest with you, I know this is an unpopular opinion, but I enjoyed Absolution for what it was, and whether or not it was intentional, it was nice to be reminded of it. Regardless, Berlin is one of the better maps in Hitman 3, with plenty of verticality and moments of natural player discovery. I'm really glad they had the confidence to do a mission like this. Chongqing is the map that got the most polarizing reactions out of me, as I despised it on my first run, but appreciated it more as I kept playing it. Still, it's one of the weaker ones in Hitman 3. There's 2 targets, Hush and Imogen Royce, and both are found roaming around complex building interiors that contain many different security checks. Out of all the maps in the game, this one required the most exploration in order to familiarize myself with it. It was very disorienting at first, as I found myself getting lost often as I tried to make my way closer to the targets. It also didn't help that I got stuck at one point because I entered a room that could only be exited if you had the proper key, and I didn't. I ran around for 5 minutes looking for a way out until eventually I got lucky and a guard walked in and I could escape out the door before it closed. It really seemed like a big oversight in the level design. As I was saying though, this level requires the most amount of player exploration in my opinion, and the intricate areas irritated me for a while. But I will concede that the mission stories really help in cutting back on this annoyance during a first run. It took me nearly an hour and a half to complete this mission on the first go, and it felt a little long in the tooth, especially because the mission concludes with 47 having to escape the underground ICA facility with his cover completely blown. I died a lot and felt the frustration mount. I couldn't believe that the game was going to put me through this every single time I played this mission. Luckily though, that doesn't end up being the case. You only have to extract the data from the central core on your first playthrough of the level, as on subsequent runs, your new handler can do it for you remotely, which cuts down on the amount of time you spend in the level drastically. This was the perfect solution to the problem I raised during the Dartmoor mission. By making the secondary objective optional, players can still engage with it whenever they want, but they aren't forced to slog through it just to finish the level. It really makes me wonder why the same thing wasn't included in the England chapter. Regardless, this objective becoming optional vastly improved my perception of the China map. Without that task weighing me down, I was free to explore all the ways to dispose of the targets, and this included my favorite way to assassinate any target in the Hitman series by using the sniper rifle. There was a vantage point with a rifle sitting nearby, just begging to be used. and I had a blast setting up situations that lured out the targets and then picking them off from there. Whatever sort of assassination plan you come up with though, it quickly becomes clear to the player how efficient and effective save scumming can be. On easy and normal, the player is afforded an unlimited number of saves, meaning they can mitigate risk at nearly any time. This is both a good thing and a bad thing. It's good because it can save the player a lot of time if they spend a while setting up an elaborate kill and want to make sure all the work isn't wasted if they screw something up. On the other hand, it's quite easy to fall into this pattern where you're saving your progress after every step you take, which certainly cuts down on player immersion. You could argue that this is the fault of the player and that they should be able to control themselves, but you shouldn't bet on players avoiding the path of least resistance. That shouldn't be an end-all solution. I understand why easy mode gives you unlimited saves, but I really think normal mode should have capped the player at 3 to 5 saves on each run. This would give them a chance to save progress at certain points without permitting them to save every couple of minutes and abusing the system. One of the series' greatest strengths has been player experimentation, and that's doubly true in this trilogy given the size and scope of these maps. But if players are always allowed to undo their mistakes, then the improvisation that results from the experimentation is going to be a lost cause. That is a disservice to the gameplay, as thinking on your feet and having to adapt is, in my opinion, a core part of the Hitman series. Removing that element of spontaneity can severely hamper the experience if the player chooses to abuse that freedom. Now, out of all my criticism towards this game, this is the one that I'm most okay with, because at the end of the day, it is just a game, and players should be able to play how they want. I wouldn't encourage people not to save scum, but it's really hard to resist the temptation in Hitman 3, and I think it could have been handled just a little bit better. Mendoza ended up being my favorite map in the game because of its atmosphere, its open level design, and the inclusion of a new objective. Do not eliminate Diana Burnwood. Being forced not to eliminate someone is not a new objective to this series, but having Diana out in the field with you was such a cool moment given her usual role of handler. There was also more intrigue going into this mission than some of the others because it's clear to the player that Diana may very well be betraying 47. At this point, it's hard to tell if she's planning to betray him or if she's actually working as a mole in order to aid in their endeavor. It's about as riveting as the series has ever gotten, especially because she has a physical presence in this level, and she's constantly being guarded and guided by one of the targets, meaning her safety is always in question. There's also this little bit of dialogue at the beginning of the mission, where one of the targets mentions something about entertaining him, most likely referring to 47. It may foreshadow what's to come, but the player might not realize it in that moment. Another cool aspect is that if you know she's going to be a target, you can take her out right here and now if you're able to avoid the barrage of gunfire that's sure to follow. It seems antithetical to offer up a hit so quickly to the player, but because there's another target, it doesn't mean the mission's over in a few minutes. I really like that. Diana's continued presence throughout this mission also leads to a lot of moments where the plot points are brought into the level. One of your targets is Don Yates, a man lined up to be the next Constant. He doesn't trust Diana and is trying to have her killed, but she's being guarded and watched by your other target. It leads to this cool cat and mouse where you have to protect Diana and take out both targets while they're in opposition of one another. It adds another level of complexity for the player to consider while also making these mission stories some of the best in the game. Yates' assassination attempt on Diana makes sense for the story, but it also added to the gameplay, and to me, this helped in elevating Mendoza far and above the other levels in Hitman 3. On top of that, there's just so many different ways to assassinate your targets in Mendoza, which may sound redundant because every level does this. However, it truly felt like this was the mission that jam-packed in as many assassination methods as possible, from having your targets take each other out, to having a target's lover kill him, to posing as a junior lawyer with a dark side, and even my favorite, grabbing that sniper rifle and getting things done the old-fashioned way. This is just a small sample size of what you can do in Mendoza, and there's a lot of variety on offer. This set of kills ended up being my favorite in the game, and obviously there's a lot of subjectivity there, but they just were. Everyone's going to have a map that they enjoyed most, so please allow me to indulge in mine for just a bit. As I mentioned, I loved all the different kill routes to take, but I also really appreciated the level design of Mendoza, because it was dense and it was layered without having a lot of wasted space and maze-like hallways while still including shortcuts. You can easily get from any part of the level to another, and this is doubly true after unlocking the shortcuts, which was a great new inclusion in this game. So yeah, between Diana's presence, the interplay of the targets, the stakes, the multitude of kill methods, the atmosphere, and the level design, Mendoza ended up being my personal favorite within this game. With that being said though, the map's plethora of disposal options also highlights another one of the game's shortcomings, but it feels more inherent to this design approach than other problems. I'm of course talking about how long the player is expected to wait in some instances. Many of the more elaborate assassinations take more prep work, and the game will recognize this work by registering when 47 is in a certain position with a certain item or disguise on. These pre-made kills have conditions to trigger, and when those conditions are met, the target will be redirected away from whatever they are doing to come to your location. Depending on their location, this can take quite a long time as they slow walk towards you. For example, in Mendoza, one pathway has you dressing up as a junior lawyer and meeting with Yates to review Diana's case file. Once you reach the room with the file and the disguise, Yates will begin moving towards you, but this can take upwards of 2 or 3 minutes for him to reach you, and in the meantime, you're just standing there waiting. It might not sound like much, but asking the player to do nothing in the game world for minutes at a time takes them out of the experience. And these wait times are ballooned even further when you set up an environmental kill that doesn't immediately lure the target to your position. For example, within the Dubai level, I took out one target by electrocuting him in a puddle of water. After setting things up, I just had to sit there and wait for him to reach the water pits. It felt like I had to wait for an eternity for him to show up. Part of this is to be expected in a simulation game though, and it seems like a problem that's unavoidable, so maybe I'm being too harsh for raising this point. I mean, you do need the targets to be moving so that they can flow through all the possible ways to kill them. Still, waiting around just doesn't feel good. Video games are an interactive medium, and being motionless in them for long enough will bore the player over time. Some might get a kick out of having a plan come together, and waiting for the right moment might be a part of the fun, but it wasn't for me. I'd like to reiterate though, I'm not denouncing the game over this point, as I think it's a flaw baked directly into this sort of approach. In other words, more is gained from this approach than is lost. Carpathian Mountains is the final mission and provides the most antithetical experience throughout this entire trilogy. Instead of offering up one massive final map to explore and uncover secrets in, we find ourselves on a train moving at blistering speeds through the snowy mountains of Romania. This severely limits the potential for the creative and experimentative gameplay that the series was founded on. And it's a bizarre way to wrap up a trilogy that was all about player expression, by throwing on the shackles and restricting freedom. We don't have a mobile target, we don't have mission stories, we don't have an open level to explore. Instead, we push linearly through a train as 47 ventures from the very back to the very front while avoiding or killing guards along the way. It culminates with a showdown against the main antagonist of this trilogy, where he just waits to be killed after realizing he's been outplayed. From what I've just described, you may think that I hate this final mission. And you'd be right, I totally do, but not for the most obvious reason. After 3 full games, I can understand the allure of changing things up so drastically in the game's final mission to mix things up and create potential for an unforgettable ending. By restricting player freedom, escape routes, and maneuverability, every decision made by the player is magnified. You know, when they aren't save scumming. This brings more tension to the gameplay, especially if you're trying to move through the vessel undetected. And I actually enjoyed this twist on the first playthrough, because it offered up a different experience without losing too much of the trilogy's systems and mechanics in the process. The restricted level size didn't bother me too much as I worked my way up the train, eager to see what the confrontation with Edwards would bring. So, unlike in other levels, where I hated them on a first run, but came to enjoy them on later runs, I actually enjoyed my first playthrough of this level, but subsequent runs soured my taste for it, as I realized that there were 3 components that damned this level. First, the design of the level encourages a lot more action and gunplay than we've come to know across the trilogy. The player's score isn't penalized for killing NPCs in this level. In fact, you gain points for doing so. This promotes an executioner's playstyle, which just doesn't feel right while playing as 47. He's an urban legend to most folks, capable of disposing targets without anyone ever realizing he was there. Yet, we're encouraged to parade around this train, wielding weapons and dispatching everyone in our way. This is especially true about 2/3 of the way through the level, where NPCs will see through your disguise rather quickly and dispatch of you even quicker. Dying over and over again in firefights doesn't feel like a very Hitman thing to do. Now, you certainly can make your way through the train undetected if you play your cards right, but fully expect to get into a couple of fights. I didn't mind it that much, I guess, but it just felt off when compared to the rest of the game, as if the rest of the game didn't prepare me for combat like this. Second, part of the justification for designing a level in this manner is that reaching Arthur Edwards, the ultimate antagonist of this trilogy, might make the player feel like that kill is earned more so than in other levels. I'm sure the developers felt like if players could just rush the target and kill them quickly in the same way you can in other missions, its story significance might not be as impactful. I don't know if that's the exact reason for why IO Interactive went for this approach, but it's the one that seems most logical to me. The problem with that train of thought is that the story has largely been an afterthought to an overwhelmingly large portion of the player base and even to the development studio to a degree. The story of this trilogy has been convoluted from the start, and short cutscenes between each mission haven't really fleshed things out all that much. And this was certainly the case in Hitman 2, where cutscenes were deemed so unimportant that they were presented as a series of still images. It was laughable, and it signaled that the gameplay was once again king in this trilogy, just like it had been for a majority of the other games in the franchise. So, sacrificing the gameplay for story significance just doesn't feel right. This same confrontation with Edwards could have just been done in an open level if things were designed intelligently, but they just aren't here. The gameplay suffers to boost up a story that nobody cared about. Oh, and then there's the secret ending, which makes no sense, but it's not canon, so I guess I can't really judge it too much. And finally, my most damning point of all is that this level design kills any chance of enjoyable replayability. Seriously, what's the point in replaying this mission? Especially if you save right before Edwards so that you can ensure that you get both of his assassinations as well as the secret ending. There's no new mission stories, no new costumes, no new tactics, no accidental kills, and no opportunities to exploit. Experiencing the level once shows you just about everything on offer here, and that's awful for a series that prides itself on replayability. We're only given 6 maps in the game, which feels like too few to me given what past games outside of this trilogy have given us. With one of them being hardly worth replaying, the value you're getting drops significantly, considering it's 1/6 or nearly 20% of the entire experience. This is the main reason for why I dislike this mission overall. It was fine on a first run, but there's hardly any reason to go back and play it again in a series that's all about player discovery and freedom. So, that concludes my thoughts and criticisms on the game's main levels, but there's still a lot more to discuss. Before we do that though, I'll wrap up this segment by ranking all 6 maps from worst to best. Keep in mind, this is my opinion. Starting with the worst, we have Carpathian Mountains, an interesting twist with no reason to replay it. At number 5, we have Dartmoor, which I know is controversial. This map, in my opinion, relied too much on the detective story to carry it, and it ended up hurting the mission more than it helped it. An unavoidable and repetitive secondary objective also doesn't help in the endeavor. At number 4, we have Chongqing. It was the most cluttered map with the most frustrating secondary objective on a first run. Still, it had some interesting mission stories, and exploring the ICA facility was fun. Now, this is where things get rather tough for me. At number 3, I'll say Berlin. I love the freedom of the level and how it encourages true player expression and exploration without too much hand-holding. The number 2 spot goes to Dubai, a breathtaking setting with tons of opportunity for mayhem. A vast and open tutorial mission that uses smart ways to guide new players without babysitting returning players. And as I've already said, Mendoza is my favorite map in the game. The level design within the Argentina map is the pinnacle for the series in my opinion. You have a ton of different segments, including the cottage, the wine facility, the fields, the party area, and they all just flow together wonderfully with many shortcuts to uncover without a ton of wasted space. The inclusion of Diana, along with how the targets remained somewhat hostile towards each other, made for a lot of fun interplay. It was the closest the game ever got to in feeling like a culmination of the series' gameplay, and I really loved it. So what are we left with then? We have 3 maps that are great, and 3 that aren't so great. At the beginning of this gargantuan segment, I said that if Hitman 3 didn't build on the core mechanics in any real and interesting ways, then the maps all had to be home runs to make this feel like a true sequel. And that just wasn't the case. There were certainly some fresh new ideas, like having a super involved mission story, providing a level without much hand-holding, and offering up a restricted map. I applaud the attempts at trying new things, but I don't think enough of them stuck to make this the premier Hitman experience. Blood money will remain king for me. I've been somewhat harsh throughout this section, but as I conclude it, let me reiterate that I did enjoy my time with Hitman 3, and I found it to be a worthy experience for the money I spent. But I just can't shake the feeling that it's more of the same, and it doesn't feel good 3 games in. One of the hardest elements to talk about in this new series is the narrative of the games. After finishing Hitman 1, I had no clue what was going on, as I couldn't really visualize the bigger narrative that the story was working towards. And Hitman 2 didn't seem to give a single shit about the narrative, as it told everything in dull and motionless still images. Hitman 3 has the most involved narrative in the trilogy, but it still takes a backseat to gameplay more times than not. And when playing, I have to imagine that a lot of players will kind of be like me. They're going to be unwilling to move on to the next level until they've gotten the full experience out of the previous one. And this can lead to a lot of instances in which the player can forget what's going on in the story when they start a new mission. Regardless, the story of Hitman 3 is the conclusion of a trilogy's worth of games, and the problem here is that the narrative is a continuation from the previous titles. It's not like, for example, the Sly Cooper franchise, where every title contains its own story. No, you pretty much have to have played Hitman 1 and 2 to have any clue of what's going on in this game, and even then, you still might not get it. As I've mentioned, those previous games didn't do a great job with their storytelling, whether it was in the cutscenes or through tying it into gameplay. The point is, expect that you might get lost in the story whether you're a new player or not. To quickly recap, the game opens with the legendary hitman Agent 47 working alongside a new ally named Gray. And yeah, he has a first name, but I can't remember it. They are working to eliminate a group of Illuminati-esque people called Providence. Providence is bad, and we are good. And that's about it. The two are led by 47's handler Diana, but Gray is untrusting of her. As the game progresses, Gray is killed because Providence leader Arthur Edwards is able to track them down in the woodlands of England. 47 escapes, but Diana is approached by Edwards about joining him as the next great leader of Providence. 47 must push onward on his own before meeting up with a girl named Olivia, who just pretty much comes out of nowhere. She might have been in the second game, but I, again, can't remember to be honest. She helps him find the info he needs, and 47's able to wipe out the now corrupt ICA's files on himself and Diana. Edwards eventually convinces Diana to join Providence, and 47 is put in a position where he's not sure if he can trust her or not. Eventually, we get this betrayal scene where Diana turns on 47 and puts him down. This is of course a ruse. 47 wakes up and is in prime position to kill Edwards and finish off Providence for good. Diana's betrayal was all just a stunt just to allow them to finish their goal, which any fan of the series is gonna see coming a mile away. And then the game ends with the two reuniting and saying some random bullshit about how there are always gonna be good people and bad people. So the speed of this recap, alongside of my unenthusiastic disposition, may have clued you in on the fact that there really isn't much to this story. And that's a shame too, because surprisingly, I do kind of like what they did with the story here in this final arc. Unlike in the previous game, every cutscene felt like it pushed the narrative forward in a new direction, and none of them ended up feeling like a waste of time. Whether it was the killing of a main character, the betrayal, or learning a tad more about our main antagonist, each felt like a necessary inclusion, despite it being part of a generic story. They were each little pieces that made up a very small puzzle. The cutscenes weren't any sort of narrative masterpieces, but they served their role and provided a little bit more justification for why we're in the levels that we are, more so than in the previous games, and so I appreciate that. Still, it'll probably take me about a week and a half or so from the time of writing this to actually publishing the finished video, and by then, I'll probably have forgotten most of the events that took place. Luckily for Hitman though, this isn't really a huge knock or criticism against the game. They didn't intend for this narrative to be the driving force, and so what we got ends up being more than enough to justify the intended gameplay experience. Like I said before, I actually liked Hitman Absolution, but it's just fair to say that it proved 47 isn't meant to take on a lot of personality traits within the scope of some grand narrative. And so the approach in this trilogy, which is a lot more hands-off, is kind of nice because it does give the characters a little bit of personality than we've seen before, but it doesn't go overboard with it, so overall I'll call it a slight improvement. Returning in Hitman 3 is the criminally underrated Contracts mode that offers up nearly endless replayability alongside of community creativity. After you've exhausted all the challenges throughout the main campaign, or at any point before that, you can dive into Contracts mode and create or complete custom hits. If you're a fanatic for this series, you'll no doubt be excited to see the return of this game mode. The developers put the tools in your hands and allow you to create contracts with as many specific conditions as you'd like. You can keep things simple and ask players to kill various NPCs however they like, or you can demand perfection by adding modifiers, such as no bullets can miss, every shot must strike the head, no one can detect you, and you must wear a certain disguise. These stipulations are presented to the player up front, and if a condition isn't met, the creator can choose to make the player automatically fail the mission. You aren't really told how to pull off the kill step by step, and this kind of creates a puzzle of sorts. You'll have to think about the surrounding spaces in new ways and contemplate how these NPC targets behave when compared to their main mission counterparts. A lot of the time, the kills won't be as elaborate simply because the levels haven't been designed in a way that every single possible target has their own unique schedules and pathways that offer up enticing opportunities to strike. Still, there's ample room for players to get creative and to come up with crazy twist kills that will rattle the brains of other players. On top of that, the game also offers up a handful of escalation contracts. These are challenges divided up into 3 phases, with each one getting progressively harder. These will usually involve alternate targets, specific kill conditions, and changed up NPC and security camera placements, which is a nice touch. And there's also the Sniper Assassin game mode, but you have to buy access to it, and I couldn't be bothered, despite the fact that the sniper rifle is my favorite weapon to wield in the series. Even without Sniper Assassin though, the game does a great job of offering up ways to keep playing after the credits roll. You're free to sink a lot of time into this game, as the content well runs very deep. So wrapping up with some presentation here, I played the PlayStation 5 version of Hitman 3, and it's certainly a step above what comes before, but that's to be expected given the better hardware. In particular, Dubai, Chongqing, and Mendoza were the best looking levels visually, and I think that's mostly due to the lighting that was very well done. I love how the neon lights bathed the rainy streets in this mission, and how the beautiful sun rays lit up the environment in Dubai. There's a familiarity about the environmental objects that makes useful items easy to recognize, and the art style isn't overly detailed, which may lead to certain things blending in too much. This might not make a lot of sense, but just the way they design objects in the environment, it ties everything together stylistically because they reuse some of them from level to level. So no matter what part of the world you venture to, it feels cohesive without being too samey. Now, you won't find the best textures or the most breathtaking visuals, but what's on offer here is still pretty good. It's also easy to read, which is critical when the player is permitted to utilize objects in the environment as well as the environment itself when performing assassinations. So overall, it was a pretty good looking game, but nothing revolutionary. The mostly dark and gritty soundtrack was a wonderful accompaniment to this game, and I really enjoyed most of the pieces when I took the time to sit back and listen. A lot of the time, it blended into the moment so perfectly that I didn't pick up on it while playing. However, it does roar to life at some points, like when you enter combat. Afterwards, I took some time to listen to the soundtrack on YouTube and was very impressed with what I heard. I just wish it had maybe been a little bit more present while playing. In terms of performance, the game only crashed on me once, and it was during the Mendoza level. However, the game also managed to maintain a solid frame rate throughout. There was, however, a few instances where models didn't load in, like this floating laundry in the China mission. The AI also has some issues, but to be honest, most of them carry over from the previous games.
This is what the little...
Hey, you!
For the most part, it works as intended, but it can be a little immersion shattering when enemies open fire on you simply for an accidental trespassing. Simultaneously, there were times when I killed a target in plain sight and massive groups of people around them just went on like it was a normal day. Someone just got killed right next to them, but they can't break their conversation on how this new skyscraper is just so luxurious. But overall, when it comes to performance, not a lot of issues to report, and so I'm gonna give it a passing grade. At the end of the day, I would call Hitman 3 the best game within this trilogy, but it comes with the caveat that it's a pretty close race. That's mostly because all 3 games look and function nearly identically, with the only real difference coming in the form of different maps. I feel as if I've been relatively harsh on this game, but let me reiterate once again that I really did enjoy it. There's some fun mission stories, a slightly more engaging story, and that same joy of discovery that comes with every new Hitman map. I'm just saddened by the lack of growth over the span of the last 5 years. Ultimately, it feels like the corporate bigwigs wanted to have their cake and eat it too by creating a series of 3 games while also including live service elements to keep people buying the new DLC maps. 5 years is a very short amount of time to release 3 games, and I could never shake the feeling that I was just playing Hitman 2016 or Hitman 2 over again. This feeling was even harder to shake given that 3 of the 6 new maps disappointed me in some way or another and felt as lackluster as some of them in the previous games. To me, this was their chance to wow players and justify having a trilogy of games instead of a singular experience. They originally intended for this series to be seasonal, with new maps releasing every month or so in an episodic way. But partway through, the backlash from fans for the episodic content and the financial incentive may have made it necessary for Hitman 2 and 3 to be released as proper sequels. It just leads to this bizarre situation where it feels like I've bought the same game 3 separate times with very little to differentiate each experience. Regardless though, I'm glad I sunk as much time into Hitman 3 as I did, as I can for sure see this game ending up as one of my favorite on the year. It does have issues, but a lot of them are either carried over from previous games, or they're just woven directly into the design's DNA. In other words, they're the bad that comes with the good. I would like to see IO Interactive continue with the Hitman series, although it seems that a James Bond game is in the near future. I think it'll be a good path for the development team to take, to spend some time away from our bald friend. Some time away from 47 might be good for the series by allowing time for fresh ideas to strike. This entire video, I've spoken about Hitman 3 as if it's the end part of the series. The story certainly seems to suggest so. It wouldn't surprise me though to see Hitman 4 released at some point down the line, or perhaps it will be another reboot. That's my hope at least, because it would be bittersweet to see the franchise end on a game that's great for the same reason that the previous 2 were. Anyway guys, that's gonna wrap it up for this critique of Hitman 3. I really gotta say thank you, as the channel has been doing tremendous lately. Like, the numbers that are coming in on watch time have been unreal to me. We went from doing 3.5 to 4 hours a day up to consistently averaging 20 or more hours of watch time per day. So thank you, really, truly, it means a lot to me, and I hope the channel can keep growing like that. If you're new and you want to see more stuff that's similar to this kind of long format approach, you can check out the Ghost of Tsushima critique, the Last of Us Part 2 critique, the Pokemon critique, which is doing unbelievably well, and then what's the other one? Oh, the Cyberpunk critique and the Sly videos. Check them out too. Anyway, thank you so much for watching. Please leave a like if you enjoyed this video. Consider subscribing for more. Follow me on Twitter at NopNapNarp. And as always, have a nice day and take care.